All right, so we've isolated the novel, at least provisionally, from Woolf's comments about atoms falling and nothing being forbidden in fiction, and about how we shouldn't mistake big things as being more important than small things in life or in literature. So we've provisionally and heuristically isolated the text from those comments. But the second step is to notice a problem in the text. Now, remember, for Cleanth Brooks, a problem um, is not simply a part of the text like that I didn't like, right? Like, I don't like that Clarissa is still hung up about Peter Walsh, or I don't like that society is so mean to Septimus Smith, right? It's not so much that kind of thing, or even the novel's really hard and I don't like it, right? That's not what is meant by a problem by Cleanth Brooks. What Brooks means is is noticing some kind of discrepancy or contradiction between meanings or attitudes or evaluations within the novel itself, right? Something that would lead us to think that doesn't really fit, or that doesn't really seem to belong here, right? And whether that's a symbol that seems to recur, whether it's a theme that sort of butts up against something else that seems to be indicating its opposite, whether it is truthfully the oscillations of narrative perspective that make the novel so difficult to read, whether it's competing portrayals of Clarissa Dalloway, right, who which would lead us to ask, well, is she our heroine or isn't she? Right? Are we supposed to admire her or hate her? What are we supposed to do? Right? So anything like that would be a kind of problem. One of the classmates, or one of the students in the class, one of your classmates, one of my students, mentioned Peter Walsh's pocket knife as a problem that stood out to her, and so we spent a bit of time working out, right, ways in which that pocket knife is kind of problematic as a symbol. Like, what sort of meanings seem to be implied by it, or simply what does it do in the scenes in which it appears, and is there a consistent way in which we can make sense of it, and if not, then is there a way to think about the pocket knife as as a kind of cluster, or a way in which Woolf balances competing desires of Peter Walsh or competing meanings of his relationship with Clarissa, um, or is there something in the pocket knife itself that parallels or suggests how the novel, in just the way that he opens and closes the pocket knife, sort of opens and closes um, the characters' minds to the past? Like, who knows what that might mean, right? That's a kind of loose analogy that might not get us anywhere, but it's interesting, nevertheless. Okay, and another student brought up the scene in which Clarissa is mending her dress and is holding scissors, and the way in which there's a kind of odd um, positioning of characters with sharp objects in their hands in this scene of reunion between Peter and Clarissa, and how that has a kind of foreboding, gives a kind of foreboding or even violent flavor to that scene, and that's a problem too, right? That could be an interesting problem that we then pursue and develop and track across the text. Whether the problem be that of violence, whether it be that of sort of sharp objects, whether it be the problem of the knife, or of puncturing or penetration or cutting or something like that, um, that could be something we pursue, right? But in the second half of class, what I did is I shared a passage in the novel that I have never shared with students before, and that I've never written about before. It's one that stood out from. This is the 11th time I've read this novel, and there are people in the world who've read it far more times, many more times than I have. Um, but nevertheless, it was a passage that stood out to me this time, and that did indicate to me problems that I've noticed before in the novel, and it's a problem of competing attitudes between characters, And so I really began thinking, especially while I was taking the bus up to Providence on Tuesday, about how this problem might recur throughout the novel, and the way in which this passage or others like it are key to showing not only how the novel itself balances competing meanings and attitudes and impulses and significations and whatnot, but maybe too how to make sense of some of what Woolf says. So instead of grounding ourselves in what Woolf says as evidence, showing how the text itself gives us enough, all on its own. It gives us enough on its own to understand what Woolf may or may not have meant in some of the passages on that handout. Okay, so so the passage I want to read is actually near the end of the novel. This is after the party has started, that the party that Clarissa Dalloway has arranged and composed for this evening. It's after Septimus's suicide. It's after Clarissa finds out about the suicide of this stranger from William Bradshaw and his wife, who are attending the party, and whom Septimus and Rhesia had visited earlier that day. It's after she wanders off on her own and has this brilliant moment of solitude in which she's reflecting on the death of this stranger, this man she's never met, and with whom she has so little in common, or does she? And so it's after that when we return to Peter and Sally Seton. No longer Sally Seton. She's married, has 5 boys, as we're told over and over again. And so starting at the bottom of 187, right, is where I want to begin. And again, I have this version of the novel, so bottom of 187. A very short paragraph begins, and Clarissa had cared for him more than she had ever cared for Richard. Sally was positive of that. So here we get the sense that Sally is telling Peter this, right? No, said Peter. Actually, I don't know how to read that. If it's dismissal or emphatic, who knows, but said Peter. Sally should not have said that. She went too far. That good fellow, there he was at the end of the room, holding forth, the same as ever, dear old Richard. Who is he talking to? Sally asked. That very distinguished-looking man. Living in the wilds as she did, she had an insatiable curiosity to know who people were. But Peter did not know. He did not like his looks, he said, probably a cabinet minister. Of them all, Richard seemed to him the best, he said, the most disinterested. Peter's insight into Richard could be a problem all on its own, but that's not what I wanted to point out this time. What I want to point out is in the next paragraph. But what has he done? Sally asked. Public works, she supposed. And were they happy together? Sally asked. She herself was extremely happy. For she admitted she knew nothing about them, only jumped to conclusions, as one does. For what can one know even of the people one lives with every day? She asked. Are we not all prisoners? She had read a wonderful play about a man who scratched on the wall of his cell, and she had felt that was true life, one scratched on the wall. Despairing of human relationships, people were so difficult, she often went into her garden and got from her flowers a peace which men and women never gave her. But no, he did not like cabbages. He preferred human beings, Peter said. Indeed, the young are beautiful, Sally said, watching Elizabeth, again Clarissa and Peter's, Richard's daughter, cross the room. How unlike Clarissa at her age. Could he make anything of her? She would not open her lips. Not much. Not yet, Peter admitted. She was like a lily, Sally said, a lily by the side of a pool. But Peter did not agree that we know nothing. We know everything, he said. At least he did. So that's the passage, right? So what problem does it raise for me? Well, it raises two competing attitudes about our existence in the world, right? I mean, what is Sally's attitude? Right? Sally's attitude is in some sense that we are irrevocably separated from each other, even from those closest to us, even from our own sons, our own daughters, our own wives, our own husbands, our own mothers, our own fathers, our own siblings, and maybe even from ourselves, right? That life is nothing but, for Sally, at least in this moment when she's talking to Peter, nothing but a kind of scratching on the wall. This is a rather pessimistic view, but we could find parts of the novel in which this seems to be true. Right? That's step 3, though. I still haven't finished articulating the problem. But we have Sally Seton, and Woolf devotes several sentences to developing this idea. And then at the very end, we get a glimpse of Peter's objection to it. Right? That no, we're not in cells scratching on walls. Right? We know, as he says, everything. Right? So it's this competition between ideas, between meanings, between attitudes toward the world and toward life, that stood out to me when I was reading this novel. And it stood out to me in a passage that is not all that well known, not all that famous, somewhat on the margins, and yet seemed to capture for me a problem that the novel does struggle with throughout. Okay. So that's step 2. Notice a problem. Boom, there it is. This paradox, right? Do we know or not know? Are we alone or connected? Right? Are we cut off or do we have access to each other? In everyday life, right? Ordinary life, ordinary day. What is the condition of our relation to an existence with other people? Right? That's the problem that stood out to me. Okay. So now there's a lot of things that I could bring up, right, in terms of how to make sense of this, because there seems to be some evidence for this with, for instance, Sally, right? Not for instance Sally, but some evidence, for Sally's point of view, right? And instead of reading thousands of passages to you, I would only ask that you look at the moments in which Woolf has us inhabit the mind or the condition of Septimus Smith. Right? It's as if Septimus himself is sort of stuck in a cell, scratching at a wall. Right? When he's first introduced to us, we see him standing at a crosswalk, and the novel says he is unable to pass. Now, literally, that just means he can't pass the street or he can't move forward because there's the commotion with the motor car. And yet, in another sense, it is the case that he can't pass. He hasn't been able to deal with, negotiate, and heal from the trauma not only of the war, but of losing Evans, right? Of losing Evans. He has not been able to develop a nourishing relationship with his wife, Rezia. And despite the moment of lucidity at the very end, right, one of the reasons he does commit suicide is partly because of his illness, but for other reasons too, he can't get out. Right? And so, like Clarissa says, in her moment of solitude, right? I'm so sorry. I get lost flipping through these pages. So, turning page 180, as she says on page 180, she had once thrown a shilling into the Serpentine. This is page 180. She actually remembers doing this back on page 9 as well. She had once thrown a shilling into the Serpentine, never anything more, but he had flung it away. They went on living. They would grow old. A thing there was that mattered, a thing wreathed about with chatter, defaced, obscured in her own life, let drop every day in corruption, lies, chatter. This he had preserved. Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate. People feeling the impossibility of reaching the center, which mystically evaded them. Closeness drew apart, rapture faded. One was alone. There was an embrace in death. Right, and so we can see, at least in some of those sentences, the way in which Clarissa herself reads in Septimus's suicide perhaps one of the greatest scratchings on the wall that he ever attempted, right? An attempt to communicate, right? The only sort of exit available to him out of this cell was out of that window, as it were. At least in the cultural conditions in which he found himself. And despite all our strivings, right, Clarissa seems to be saying, we are alone. We are alone. Right? Okay, so that's a recurring pattern, right? We've gone to Septimus and we've circled back to Clarissa, right? Pages before Sally Setton's sort of theory of how we are each stuck in our separate selves, right? But Clarissa is also gives evidence for the ways in which this isn't true, right? That this is not the case, right? So if we flip back to page 9, the moment in which she first remembers the moment of throwing away a shilling into the Serpentine. Let's go back there. Actually, bottom of page 8, okay? This is Clarissa. Her only gift was knowing people almost by instinct, she thought, walking on. If you put her in a room with someone, up went her back like a cat's, or she purred. Devonshire House, Bath House, the house with the china cockatoo, she had seen them all lit up once, and remembered Sylvia, Fred, Sally Setton, such hosts of people, and dancing all night, and the wagons plodding past to market, and driving home across the park. She remembered once throwing a shilling into the Serpentine. But everyone remembered. What she loved was this, here, now, in front of her, the fat lady in the cab. Did it matter then, she asked herself, walking towards Bond Street, did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her. Did she resent it? Or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely? But that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things, here, there, she survived, Peter survived, lived in each other, she being part, she was positive, of the trees at home, of the house there, ugly, rambling all to bits and pieces as it was, part of people she had never met. Septimus. Being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she had seen the trees lift the mist. But it spread ever so far, her life, herself. So in that passage, whereas in the passage where she remembers throwing the shilling into the river, or into the Serpentine, after Septimus commits suicide, it's as if she is thinking to herself what Sally Setton thinks, right? That we are alone, irrevocably alone in this world, right? Even from people who seem close to us, right? We know we can't really know anything about them. We're cut off from them. The best we can do is scratch on the wall separating us, and so communicate through that wall by way of scratches, right? But then here, the first time she mentions throwing away the shilling, Clarissa seems to be saying something that Peter says after, right, Sally Seton sort of expresses her position about each of us in a cell, Peter says, no, we do have access. We do have access. We know everything. Right? Now, what we might say here, right, and actually, let me pause. We can see this at work in all sorts of other ways in the novel, too. Right, that the novel, and now I'm beginning to try to move it, right? I've tracked this problem through a few parts of the book. We could track it through many more. But what we might begin seeing is that the novel doesn't prefer one of these over the other. It sort of gives equal time to both of them. And it doesn't necessarily produce a cheery picture about knowing or not knowing or having access or being cut off, because it balances the notion that we are, in some sense, cut off from each other. Even those closest to us, most directly related to us, we are kind of cut off, right? Much in the same way that Septimus is cut off from London around him, forced to wander alone. Yet there are ways in which we laterally, without even knowing it, do have access to others, do have effects on others, just like others have effects on us. And so that miracles like Clarissa learning about the death of Septimus Smith can produce such a robust moment of insight, right? Whether or not that insight will follow Clarissa once she goes back to the party is another matter, right? But nevertheless, there is something of a miracle in the way in which Septimus's suicide does manage to communicate something to a woman he's never met, and with whom he would have no reason to spend time in his own life, right? So again, the novel sort of clusters those together and holds them in a kind of harmony that is a bit saddening, right? Maybe a bit pessimistic to some of us, but nevertheless still quite breathtaking in how it unfolds. Right? So that's kind of step 4, the way I've tried to show that those competing attitudes actually show us something about how the logic of the novel operates. And to support that idea even further, we could point out things like the narrative perspective, right? So let's read. Video's getting a little longer than I wanted it to be, but I'm just going to read the first paragraph of the novel in order to demonstrate another way in which this competition between access and separation, between knowing and not knowing, between being stuck in a cell and having a kind of communion with people, even people we've never met, a communion that lasts even after we die, right? Not in the kind of afterlife. Remember, Clarissa is a rather vehement atheist, but in another way. How this competition is actually at work in the very, very perspective of the novel itself, meaning how it is told, the perspective from which it is told. So let's just quickly read the first page. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. For Lucy had her work cut out for her. The doors would be taken off their hinges. Rumpelmeyer's men were coming. And then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh, as if issued to children on a beach. What a lark, what a plunge! For so it had always seemed to her when, with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Burton into the open air. How fresh, how calm, stiller than this, of course. The air was, in the early morning, like the flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave, chill and sharp, and yet, for a girl of 18, as she then was, solemn, feeling, as she did, standing there at the open window, that something awful was about to happen. Looking at the flowers, at the trees with the smoke winding off them, and the rooks rising and falling, what a lark, what a plunge, standing and looking until Peter Walsh said, musing among the vegetables, was that it? I prefer men to cauliflowers. Was that it? Notice we see right in that I prefer men to cauliflowers, we get another a sort of anticipation of that later conversation between Sally and Peter. That's not why I'm reading this, but just want you to note the way in which pages in this book connect up with each other, right? That there is an access between pages and passages that the sequence of the pages doesn't control, right? That page 9 connects to 180, that page 3 connects to page 189, right? In these sort of tunnels of echoing. Okay. But anyway, keep going. Was that it? So she's trying to remember what Peter said. He must have said it at breakfast one morning when she had gone out on to the terrace. Peter Walsh. He would be back from India one of these days, June or July. She forgot which, for his letters were awfully dull. It was his sayings one remembered, his eyes, his pocket knife, there's the pocket knife, his smile, his grumpiness, and when millions of things had utterly vanished, how strange it was. A few sayings like this about cabbage. So that those opening paragraphs and opening sentences can be incredibly difficult for a first-time reader of Mrs. Dalloway. And why? Because the narrative perspective, it seems, is so close, almost cinematically so close to Clarissa Dalloway, that it obfuscates and obscures for us what is actually going on, right? It's almost as if we were pressing our faces up against a giant television screen, a giant television screen that's supposed to make it easy for us to see what's going on. But our proximity to it is actually messing up, right, our ability to see what's happening, right? And so even in the very perspective itself, we have access to Clarissa's thoughts, but we are so close to them. We are so close to the operation in which Clarissa, in the present in 1923, is transported back to being 18 years old that fast in the middle of a sentence, right? That it can make us forget that we're not at Burton, we're in London, 1923, right? 1923, not the late 19th century at Burton. So anyway, just to show that even the perspective itself is performing and working out and balancing this problem of access and separation, right? And even the way it transitions between characters, right? With the sounds of Big Ben, with the sound of the motor car back front firing, with the aeroplane flying overhead, that each of these things are ways to compose and give access to a multiplicity of characters, over 100 minor characters in this novel, right? And yet each of them, while looking at those things or hearing those things, know nothing about one another's lives, right? So there too, each character in a separate cell, and yet connected at the same time by way of these other events or other objects. So that's another way in which that tension between, or that paradox between access and separation, again is brought into a kind of harmony where one doesn't trump the other, but that they exist in a kind of cooperation, collaboration, and competition with one another throughout the novel. Okay. One, of course, could say a great deal more than this. I was writing down some other ways in which this operates, that the problem of connection, intimacy, continuity is always, it seems, at odds with ignorance, loneliness, and invisibility in this novel. In the difference between Septimus Smith and crowds, the discrepancy between Clarissa Dalloway and Peter Walsh's versions of each other, the way in which the mad must be quarantined, literally cut off, sent away from the workings of the city itself. The image of the thread that is snapped or cut, the spider's thread, after Richard Dalloway's luncheon with Hugh Whitbread and Lady Bruton. Passages about mystery and love and religion late in the novel, after Miss Kilman leaves with Elizabeth. This is on pages 123 to 25. Peter Walsh's dream, pages 55 to 57, of the solitary traveler, the idea of being solitary, again cut off, again in a dream. His fantasy from 51 to 53, following this random girl through London, somewhat creepy, we might add, but the way in which he's fantasizing in a story in closeness and intimacy with her, that of course is premised upon the radical separation from her. They're complete strangers, right? on pages 46 and 66, Clarissa Dalloway and Septimus Smith respectively articulate the feeling of being utterly alone. Septimus's worry on 84 to 85 that he can't feel, that he's not connected to other people, which of course is so funny because Septimus seems to be the only one who's feeling the aftermath of World War I. Right? This is a city that's experiencing a kind of amnesia, as it were, that the war is over. And yet for Septimus, it's not. He lives it daily. So on the one hand, he can't feel, but on the other hand, he's feeling everything, right? He's feeling everything. And of course we could keep going. Clarissa Dalloway's ignorance about, the terror that Armenians had undergone in Turkey, right? Her admission on page or confession on page 117 that she doesn't give a damn about Armenians. She doesn't care for Armenians. Of course, in that sense, she's in herself cut off from that horror, in a sense. And yet, by naming it, the novel, nevertheless, is tethering together its own concerns to those sort of global concerns at the same time. So yeah. So anyway, I hope that makes sense, and I hope I showed how to move from isolating the text. To notice I did not rely on any of the passages on the handout by Woolf. So isolating the text, finding a problem, that tension between Sally and Peter at the end of the novel, tracking the pattern through Clarissa, through Septimus, through the perspective of the novel, through other things, only to show that in some sense one doesn't win out over the other, but rather they feed each other into a much more complex picture of what the novel has to say, as it were, or, I mean, this is to reduce it to having a meaning or a moral, right? But so maybe we should say what the novel expresses about what it means to live and to exist post-war, right, in London. And maybe just what it even means, in a more philosophical sense to exist as a human being. So, and I say that in terms of what the novel might be doing, not what we should take away from it, but maybe what the novel itself is doing. Okay, all right. So that went much longer than I wanted it to, but I hoped that helped, and I gave page numbers on purpose because I want it would be beneficial maybe for you to go back and check those pages on your own. Okay. So all right, next week we talk about structuralism, fun, and also those. So read those pages from Parker, but also I've posted 3 articles about Mrs. Dalloway that I also want you to read for next week. Okay? All right. As always, if you have questions, phone me, text me, email me. I'm available. Okay. Take care.